Hi all, I have an absolutely fabulous game to show you today. This is Carlos Torre Repetto against Emanuel Lasker in the Moscow 1925 tournament. So Torre plays the Torre Attack, so this is a bit of a relative to the London system. So knight f3, but instead of bishop f4, the bishop goes to g5. Only one small step away from f4, but quite a lot of difference. We have c5, e3. One of the characteristics usually is that white doesn't really want to play c4 later. We have c takes d4, e takes, bishop e7. Because white's not putting a pawn on a light square, you could often argue the dark square grip of white is much more intense. It's all about the dark squares, and it seems a bit cozier actually from a dark square perspective, in my view. So knight bd2 is played here, d6, now c3. So white is gripping a lot of dark squares here with this pawn chain, and it's pretty solid pawn chain here. Okay, it's missing its triangle ingredient. One pawn has been swapped off, but white does seem to have a fairly solid position. Knight bd7, bishop d3, b6, and now knight c4. This is very provocative, trying to ask black to put another pawn, for example d5, would be a bad strategic mistake in my view, putting another pawn on the light square, because it would weaken e5. For example here, this would be a very cozy dark square play position where that e5 post is very, very nice. And for example, knight c6 could lead black into trouble. This is a fantastic position with an advantage for white. So yeah, pretty cozy stuff. So bishop b7. Instead, we have queen e2, queen c7, both sides castle, rook fe1, rook fe8, rook ad1. So white's play so far seems very, very nice and logical. Knight f8. And now things get a bit weird now. Bishop c1, but it's got an idea just to use the parking space g5 for the knight for probing the black kingside. Lasker's kingside looks pretty solid with the knights both there on f8 defending securely h7. We have one of them leaving knight d5, and we have knight g5 now. And here, one of the points of knight d5 positioning was to hammer white on structurally the c3 pawn, so b5 with tempo. If instead of this rook ad8 as an example, maybe the queen could come in and provoke a weakness like this, and maybe there's a small edge for white here. So black's reacting, Emanuel Lasker's reacting quite aggressively, to attack the structure. And here, after b4, with this knight on d5, it's not palatable to play knight c4 here. And knight b5 seems a bit of a tactical liability for the knight being trapped later, for example, queen b6 and a6. So in fact, there's a bit of a concession here, at least structurally it seems. C takes b4, this isolates the queen's pawn. So fragmenting white's nice solid structure. Has Lasker's play been completely justified now? We have queen h5, pretty crude stuff, looking at h7. And now Lasker took on g5. Perhaps better here than taking on g5, because it does kind of strengthen white's dark square play, potentially. Perhaps better is actually g6. Maybe that's more justified here. After queen h3, just take out the d3 bishop. And positionally, it looks as though this is an awkward knight. This looks like a fantastic position for black. For example, here, e5. It looks as though black's doing absolutely fine. That looks at e1, and white could be in severe trouble here in a few different ways. So it's an interesting decision, this bishop takes g5. It gives a bishop without the counterpart, the dark square bishop without a counterpart. We have knight takes d3. And this gives, quite an aggressive rook on that third rank now for a moment. Queen a5 pinning, in the relative sense, it's a relative pin against the h5 queen. The problem with relative pins, it's also looking at e1 as well. The trouble with relative pins, sometimes they can backfire. They're not legally enforceable absolute pins. They can backfire on the pinner sometimes. That's something to be borne in mind. White plays b4 now, so trying to distract away from this pin. We have queen f5 being played. If queen takes b4, bishop d2 would safeguard the rook, but it looks as though, for example, here, you know, with queen c6 threatening checkmate, that black should be fine after queen d7. But this wasn't played. We have instead queen f5. And now a tactical move, very, very, well, direct, rook g3. So there looks to be some nasty threats emerging potentially. We have h6 just trying to say, look, your bishop's pinned. What are you going to do about it? And the reaction is actually very, very clever. This drunken knight on a3 becomes the hero of the position now. It comes into the fray with knight c4. Yeah, a real hero of the position hitting d6, basically saying, you know, there's going to be trouble if you take on g5. So queen d5 is played. If h takes g as an example, knight takes, and the knight is also crucially looking at f7 here as well. So it's not enough just to protect the bishop. You know, if queen d5 taking on f7, and there's big trouble there. And, you know, maybe taking on b7 if it's not even mating. But it looks absolutely like something black shouldn't entertain here at all. So we have, you know, basically black would be forced to defend f7 and give back the piece. And white should have a small edge there. So knight c4, we have actually queen d5. So a bit of a reversal here. It's trying to keep this absolute pin. And we have now knight e3. And here the queen, unfortunately, has to go to a place where it's not actually protected by another piece. So guess white's play here, if just on note here, if queen takes d4, then in fact, because that bishop's not pinned now, you know, bishop takes h6 is pretty dangerous. This is a big advantage for white. Taking out that h-pawn means there's a big h-file attack coming. And the bishop is also eyeing any escape route of the king here, you know, if the king wanted to try and escape. So this is especially dangerous sometimes. So white would have the edge there. So anyway, so queen b5 was played. In this position, for 1,000 points, what would you play with white? So white play here. I'll give you 10 seconds to pause the video. Okay. White plays bishop f6, so the pin is backfiring against the unprotected piece. It's attacking the queen, it's attacking g7. It's a double attack. So you can't really trust relative pins because they can backfire against the pinner. So it's offering the queen, so there isn't too much choice. So Lasker takes, but now rook takes g7 check, king h8. And Chess Games has a nickname for this game, the Seventh Seal, playing on this fantastic film, which is a must-see watch. It's about 8.1, 8.2 on IMDb, by the way. It's got chess in it. It's an iconic film, the Seventh Seal. But it's been given this nickname because now white plays rook takes f7 check, and we have a fabulous windmill tactic. We can play another check. The thing is, the windmill or seesaw means that the king is going backwards and forwards between usually the two same squares. So this is a classic windmill, taking on b7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, king h8. An engine suggests white could have actually been even greedier, taking on a7, but perhaps he didn't want to activate this rook later. So white just cashed out here with rook g5 check just to get his queen back. So yeah, it was actually possible to be even greedier, just take everything on the 7th there, clear up the 7th, and that would be better for white as well. But he plays rook g5, leaving that pawn, but going for the queen. And this position is a big advantage for white, even though Lasker's getting back a piece. White's up in pawns after all that. So here, that neglects h6, that is taken. So 6 pawns versus 3. The rook drops back, and yeah, it's enough pawns up basically. That's supported. That's taken. Knight c4, protecting a3, hitting d6. d6 is protected. Hitting f4, that's protected. Knight d7. That looks a bit hopeless. Just giving up e6. King g5, and now just g3, protecting the first rank no trick for back row mate here. So protecting the rook, and also it means there's no back row mate. And here Lasker resigned. He's just several pawns down without much compensation at all. So the Torre Attack is another feature of this game, played by Torre. A bit of an iconic game, and it's an iconic film reference by ChessGames.com, so we should all watch The Seventh Seal as well. And it's a fabulous example of the windmill tactic, as well as, you know, exploiting the vulnerability of the relative pins as opposed to an absolute pin. So that was actually a question posed to me. I mentioned this on Quora, actually. If you imagine that there's a white king on h5, just fictionally, then this bishop would never be able to move. It would be an absolute pin, but because it's a relative pin all the time, white managed to get this piece to be loose. So, you know, trying to exploit this backfire now, which you can do quite often. You can rebel against these relative pins. So that was a fantastic rebellion move, bishop f6. So a classic, iconic game, and explains the windmill tactic, you know, using the vulnerabilities of unprotected pieces, and using the Torre Attack, which is a very dart square, grippy, solid, cozy system. So that's a great system as well, relative to the London system. These London systems, Torre Attacks, I think they have this dart square control feature that c4, it kind of loosens the dart squares, but when you play London system or Torre systems, they've got much more control over the dart squares. Okay, I hope you got something from it. If you want to challenge me for a game, kingscrusher.tv or bit.ly/chessworld. There's playlists at bit.ly/leaderchess, bit.ly/stockfishchess. Or you can check out my Discord chat, kingscrusher.tv/discord. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares, subscribes with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much.